This presentation on the production and supply chain of coffee beans is brought to you by Hannah, Avery, Lucas, Emma, and Emily from the University of Guelph Department of Fair for the class Fair 1400 Economics of the Agri-Food System. A brief overview of the product supply chain is pictured on this slide. To start the chain, we will focus on how coffee is harvested, what happens in the processing stage, how they are shipped, roasted, and then shipped again by exporters. This next section of the PowerPoint covers what happens when the beans are sent to a processor. This step is often referred to as milling and is one of the most important post-harvest steps. There are some farms that grow and harvest beans that also process them themselves. However, majority are sent to a processor, so for the purpose of this presentation, that is what we are going to focus on. As mentioned, milling is one of the most important post-harvest steps. The coffee plant produces coffee cherries and the beans are the seeds that are inside. This processing step involves removing the various layers of the cherry to retrieve the seeds. The cost of producing coffee largely depends on the type of coffee bean and the way it is processed. On average, this step costs between 50 cents and $1 per pound of coffee. Coffee quality depends importantly on the type of processing that the beans receive. For a higher quality coffee, the cherries go through wet processing. This means that there needs to be a certain level of ripeness and the beans should be hauled to a processing washing station within 10 to 12 hours after harvesting. The export level for producing this level of coffee is 20% higher because it has a greater premium over unwashed coffee. Processing coffee is very water intensive and the wastewater can contaminate rivers and streams. With this together, it is considered very unsustainable. Over the last 30 years, growing demand for coffee has led to a 60% increase in production, according to the International Coffee Organization. This causes a high usage of water and energy resources and takes about 140 liters of water to produce just 125 millimeters of coffee.
After the milling is complete, the beans are then imported from other countries to be sold in exchange with buyers in the new country. While coffee is in this stage, the beans are still unroasted and are referred to as green coffee. Before the green coffee can be shipped, the buyers must request a pre-shipment sample that has to be approved for quality before moving forward. Once this sample has been approved, the green coffee is then able to be shipped to the U.S. and from there it can be shipped to Canada to be bought by roasters. For the green coffee to reach Canada, you need to ship by truck. Truck drivers are currently hard to come by and are in high demand because of the large increase in production of coffee over the last 30 years. Right now, the U.S. needs approximately 80,000 more truck drivers to meet the demand for coffee. Furthermore, Canada is 15 places above the U.S. regarding their coffee consumption worldwide, which means that the demand for coffee truck drivers is much more severe in Canada than in the U.S. The two means of transport to ship green coffee overseas is by ships and airplanes. Ships are the most common method of overseas transport, with over 80% of green coffee being shipped this way. A pro for this method is that it's cheap, but a problem is that it can take a very long time, leaving the coffee on board vulnerable to the elements and have a higher chance of getting bad. The second method, using airplanes, is a much more expensive method, but the reason why this money might be worth it to some buyers is that it is much faster and therefore unlikely to have problems with political or environmental issues. The other issue that arises with this method, though, is that it is only small amounts that can be shipped at a time, so you don't get much for what you pay for.
In this step of the supply chain, coffee beans are then sent to faculty from processors to be roasted. As the coffee beans arrive, they have already been processed to a certain extent, which is needed for the roasting process to begin. The coffee beans are placed in as green beans, and the temperatures begin to rise from 180 degrees to 250 degrees Celsius, which the beans are then cooked from anywhere between 7 to 20 minutes, depending on the desired level of roast you require. The methods of roasting are big metal cylinders rotated over a source of heat, either by coal or hot air being propelled throughout. As the temperatures begin to increase, the release of steam begins to appear. However, within that steam release, there is also release of both carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide, as well as other volatiles within the coffee bean. As the release of these steams occur, there is a decrease in overall weight in the bean. The bean can lose anywhere from 14 to 23% in weight. Although they are losing weight during the roasting process, the internal gas pressure is expanding the coffee bean up to 30%. During the roasting process, the beans begin to darken into a rich brown color and into a porous texture. When the steam is released, it cracks open the coffee bean and then begins to break down the caffeine molecule into its independent molecules. Whereas if you were to brew unroasted coffee beans, the coffee beans have not been broken into and the molecule has not been broken down. Therefore, roasted coffee beans actually have a higher percentage of caffeine within them compared to non-roasted coffee beans. And fun fact, if the beans are chemically decaffeinated, it would remove all trace amounts of solvent residues.
Once the coffee beans have finished their roasting process, the coffee is then shipped by exporters. Coffee is majorly imported into Canada. The importation process of coffee into Canada from producing countries begins with importers that are based out of international countries and the United States. The beans begin by being shipped into the United States either by trucks, boats, or planes. Once the beans arrive in the U.S. importers make arrangements with the exporters for the coffee beans to be loaded. At this stage, they are also required to ensure that the buyer is well informed of the details of the contract. Once these contracts are in place, containers of coffee get further shipped to Canada, where they will arrive at their designated Canadian warehouse. Upon arrival at the Canadian warehouse, the beans go through an arrival approval process, where the buyer has to approve of the quality of the beans before ownership can be transferred. The last step of the coffee supply chain in Canada is the importation and processing of coffee. Often, green beans are shipped into Canada without being roasted. In the cases where this occurs, the coffee beans are sent to a roasting facility to be roasted. The roasting facilities in which they are sent to are often found near the place where the coffee beans will be consumed to help expand the shelf life of the beans. Following the roasting process, the coffee beans are then packaged into dark, dry, and airtight packaging to ensure that the quality of the beans is maintained for as long as possible. After packaging of the beans, they are then shipped to local grocery stores and retailers in Canada. It is known that coffee is very valued by Canadians. In 2020, statistics showed that Canada imported $1.17 billion worth of coffee in Canada, making them the largest importer globally. Canada's market for importing coffee is growing at a very fast rate in comparison to the market of other countries.
Thank you for watching. Here is a list of our references.